Well, hi, my name is Greg, and welcome to the long-awaited Chapter 9 in my 1949 P3 Rover restoration story. It's taken me a while to get around to shooting this bit of video. I've been, since I shot the last video, I've been back at work, and also, whatever spare time I have, I've been trying to do work on the car rather than shoot video about it. But anyway, I'm glad I got around to it today. So in this chapter, I'm going to cover work that I did on the front end suspension and steering on the car. The job, I have to say, took me a whole lot longer than I ever expected. A couple of reasons for that, I guess. I mean, I wasn't that familiar with working on front end suspension and steering. So I was on a pretty steep learning curve as I was going through. And also, ended up finding a lot more work than I originally anticipated. Although, to be honest, that's been a pretty consistent theme through this whole restoration process. But anyway, I'm glad I undertook it. I've enjoyed the process. It's just been a little bit frustrating in terms of how long it's taken. As I go through, I'll just give an overview of the work that I did and try and explain it as best I can. Hope you enjoy the show, so on with the show now. This is one of the early shots I took as I was stripping down the front suspension. As you can see, I've got a fair bit of work ahead of me, years and years worth of mud and dirt and grime. You can also see I've done some previous work. The brake drum is in good shape because I've already done work on the brakes. And also the original shock absorber I'd taken out. I was just trying the new one out for size. This shot taken very recently after I've done a lot of work, so almost at the end of all the work that I need to do on the front suspension now, but just included it as a before and after shot. For quite a while I couldn't figure out a way to strip down the front suspension. I had trouble removing these upper links that you can see in this photo. That they had rubber bushes inside them, and the rubber bushes obviously been there for a very long time, and it was like they're bonded in place. In the end, I found a fairly cheap tool from Super Cheap Auto, which is a ball joint separator, and that did the trick pretty well. As you can see, one of the biggest jobs I had ahead of me was just cleaning parts. Pretty much everything stripped off the front end and suspension at this point. These are one of the pairs of lower links to the front suspension. So at this point I'm just pulling everything apart with a plan to get these parts powder coated. This part was right at the top of the front road springs and sort of fitted into the top of the road spring. As you can see, a fair bit of surface rust there, but they cleaned up pretty well in the end. Now these are the two plates that go underneath the lower links and retain the road springs. It'll make more sense when I show you some later shots. And here are the springs out of the car and just before I clean them up. And here's the same parts after a lot of work. I just cleaned them up with a wire brush, but a lot of wire brushing, and then sprayed them with anti-corrosive sort of matte black paint. Here are those steering linkages and the tie rods and also the relay lever bracket just after I'd removed them from the car. As you can see, quite a mess. In fact, in real life, I think there's more work there than there even appears to be here. I actually had to begin the cleaning process on the tie rods by virtually chiseling away the caked on mud. At this point I've done some cleaning. I kind of cleaned up the relay lever assembly pretty well. I've got an assortment of parts here that are from the front suspension and from the steering. So I've been working on those for quite a while. They were quite dirty, sort of covered in many layers of mud over the years, and on the steering box side also covered in oil that had leaked from the steering box. You can see some of the work I've done here. These have cleaned up quite well. So one of the tie rods, it's got a ball joint at either end. The ball joints, as far as I could see, weren't in too bad a shape. The rubber boots that keep the grease in were perished, and the grease that was in there had obviously been there for a very long time. So I've cleaned those up, put new rubber boots on, and obviously fresh grease in there as well. These rubber boots are actually a Land Rover part, but they seem to fit fine. So they're looking good. And I should be able to get them back on the car pretty soon. These parts are from the front suspension, where shock absorber mounts on one side and other components of the steering on the other side.
Here's the shot of the steering linkages and tie rods and the relay lever assembly ready to go back into the car after a lot of work. As you can see, they've cleaned up well, everything's repainted, all the fasteners are replaced. Lots of work here. Pretty much in the centre of all the sort of, steering linkages, there was a rubber bush that I had to replace. I had trouble buying one, so I ended up turning up my own using a sort of machine grade polyurethane. Here's pretty much the finished job, but it did take a bit of mucking around and experimenting with my cutting tools. I never machined rubber before, and it's very different to turning steel. Another bit of work I had to do was there's a jacking plate, which is the front underneath the car, and it also sort of protects the steering lever, relay lever mechanism. Sorry, mine was a bit bent out of shape, so I just did a fair bit of work and just straightening it up. It also has like a couple of tabs at the bottom there, and one of them was almost broken off. Here's a plate with the tab broken off completely in preparation to weld it back on again. I've got a next bit is a short piece of video where I just show a sort of speeded up process of beating this plate back into shape again. One of the final jobs I had to do on this bracket was just to, after I'd flattened it out and got rid of all the dents and what have you in it, I'd inadvertently sort of spread it a little bit as well, so that the holes didn't then line up on the chassis when I tried to remount it. So I had to just bend it a little bit. So I made up just a bit of a rough jig to do that. Here's the steering box, well on the way to being dismantled. It wasn't too hard to get apart, but boy was it hard to put back together again. This is the top plate from the steering box. I'm just going to show the other side in a minute and show you some work I had to do on that. Now this is the underside of that top plate, and as you can see it's got a groove milled in there, and as you can see there's some wear in that groove. Now this groove basically there's a roller that goes inside there, and this groove gives a guide for that roller. So in the end I decided I'd repair the wear there. Well, here we are in my shed. I've got the top plate from the steering box after I welded it set up on the table of my milling machine here. I'll just zoom in on it. So there's the top plate, there's the section that I've welded. What I've done is I've clamped this top plate of the steering box to the milling machine table, and I've used this dial indicator here to determine that I've got this slot running straight. I've used the dial indicator against an unworn section of the slot. So as we wind the table across, we get pretty minimal movement of that needle, which is good. So now when I put a milling cutter in there, and I should be able to just touch on that edge and machine all this excess weld off. See how we go. I think I've milled it back as far as I dare at this stage. I can just hear the milling cutter touching some of the unworn face now. So I'll just do one final pass, make sure that it's locked. So the milling cutter's just taking just a tiny little bit off that side face of the slot now. But I think we're just about there. Prior to cleaning up this side face, I machined the top face down flat, or very close to flat. I think I'll just do the final little bit with a file actually, and just blend it in with a hand file. That's pretty good. I might just go just a tiny little bit lower now, but that's all. Okay, I reckon I'm finished now. I'll just focus in so you can see what I've done. You can just begin to see some witness marks of the cutter on the bottom surface here. So basically I've gone as low as I dare go. I don't want to make it any deeper than it originally was. And you can see some witness marks on the side here in places only slightly. So I just need to probably just blend this in with a file or even a bit of abrasive paper and just take the edge off that there, and it's all done. This shows the oil seal at the bottom of the steering box assembly. This is the old one I think, but obviously I put a new one in there. Okay, what I have here is a steering relay lever bracket assembly, which is a bit of a mouthful. I'm just going to zoom in on a diagram from the Rover Sports Register parts book, which shows some of the front suspension here. So now you can see the coil spring here, and then I'm just going to point to, so that's the assembly here, which is part of your steering mechanism really. Now I've taken it out. This is looking a whole lot better than it did. It was covered in grimy, greasy oil, and you basically couldn't even recognise what it was when I first took it out. So that's looking a whole lot cleaner. Got a few problems with it though. There's this cover plate which screws on to the bottom of the assembly. That, as you can see, has a hole in it. It's not supposed to have a hole in it, and that's created a bit of a chain sort of reaction and problems. There's a shaft that goes through this assembly and a bronze bearing bush at either end. It's my dog over there. She's getting a bit enthusiastic about something now. So that whole assembly has oil in the centre of it. It's supposed to have oil in it, but with that capping broken, the oil is obviously drained out. So what I've found is that these bearing bushes are really quite worn out, as is the shaft. So I'm going to have to remake the bronze bearing bushes and this shaft. So that's what I'll cover in shortly. Here I've just been removing the old bronze bearing bushes from the assembly. As I might have mentioned, I think in the video, they were worn out. So largely I'm just getting them out so I can measure everything up properly. And here I'm just starting the process of turning up one of those bronze bearing bushes. Turning the second of the two bearing bushes now. I'm just turning the outside diameter. So in this shot I've got the new shaft, the new bronze bearing bushes that are turned up on the left, and the old parts on the right. I also forgot to mention I turned up a new cap as well out of aluminium. Not an exact replica of the original. I didn't do some of the sort of cutting in sort of relief work, but that wasn't really necessary, so I've left it this way. It's probably a bit stronger actually.
Hi, it's Greg back again, and I've also got Happy, the Papillon puppy, who's decided to help me, haven't you? That's good. Now what I've done is I've decided to divide this chapter 9 up into 2 parts. So we'll call this the end of part A of chapter 9, and I'll begin part B shortly. Reason I've done that is there's just a lot of work that's been covered in the suspension and steering, and it's proving to be a little bit too much to fit into one chapter. Okay, so bye for now, and stay tuned for part B.